There are days when fear does not look dramatic. It does not arrive like thunder. It comes quietly. It sits beside you in the early morning. It follows you into the night. And sometimes it wears the face of an ordinary day. You wake up. You check your phone. You see a message you were afraid to read. A silence that feels too long. A delay that means too much. A small change in someone's voice. And suddenly, something inside you tightens. Your chest grows heavy. Your thoughts begin to race. You try to stay calm. You try to act normal. But deep down, you already feel it. That old familiar trembling. The fear of losing something. The fear of being rejected. The fear of not being enough. The fear of what may happen next. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever smiled in front of others? While quietly carrying a storm inside, have you ever stayed silent? Not because you were at peace, but because you were too tired to explain the weight in your heart. Have you ever endured so much in silence that even your own mind began to feel like an unsafe place? There is a certain kind of pain in fear, not loud pain, not visible pain, but the slow pain of anticipation, the pain of waiting, the pain of imagining the worst before it even comes. And that pain can exhaust a person. It can make you doubt your steps. It can make you hesitate before speaking. It can make you question your worth. It can turn a simple moment into an invisible battle. Many people live like this, quietly, carefully, always bracing for impact, always preparing for loss, always trying to control what cannot fully be controlled. And after a while, it becomes hard to tell whether you are living or merely defending yourself from life. This is what makes fear so heavy. It does not always break you at once. Sometimes it wears you down slowly, through overthinking, through sleepless nights, through conversations replayed in your head, through imagined disasters that never happen, and wounds that still feel real. But there is another way to meet this darkness. A quieter way. A steadier way. Not a way that pretends fear is not there. Not a way that demands instant courage. But a way of standing still, even while the mind is shaking. A way of breathing, even when the heart is unsettled. A way of seeing fear, without immediately becoming its prisoner. This is where the Stoic spirit begins. Not in perfection, not in coldness, not in pretending to be unbreakable. It begins in honesty, in the simple moment when a person admits, yes, I am afraid. Yes, this hurts. Yes, I feel weak right now. And still, I will not abandon myself. There is dignity in that moment. There is strength in that quiet refusal to collapse. Because overcoming fear does not always begin with bold action. Sometimes it begins with a softer decision to remain, to observe, to endure one moment without running from it. And perhaps that is where peace first enters, not as noise, not as triumph, but as a small inner steadiness in the middle of everything that once made you tremble. And before we can understand how to live this way, we must first look more closely at what fear is really doing inside us. When someone hurts you, the first wound is often not the deepest one. The first wound is the word, the action, the coldness, the silence. But what follows inside us is often heavier. We begin to ask questions. Why did they speak to me like that? Why did they ignore what I felt? Why did they treat me as if I meant so little? And without noticing it, their behavior begins to enter our identity. We do not only feel pain, we begin to feel reduced. We begin to feel judged. We begin to feel as though their cruelty has revealed something about us, as though their rejection has measured our worth, as though their anger has exposed some flaw we failed to hide. But this is where a quieter kind of understanding begins. A Stoic mind does not deny that people can wound us. It does not pretend harsh words are soft, or betrayal is easy, or disrespect is harmless. It simply asks us to look deeper before we accept the meaning of what happened, because very often what people do to us is not a clean reflection of who we are. It is a reflection of what they carry, their fears, their confusion, their habits, their pride, their pain, their ignorance. A person who has never learned how to face their own frustration will often throw it into someone else's heart. A person who feels small inside may try to feel powerful by making another person feel less. A person who is restless, bitter, or inwardly broken may not know how to touch the world gently. And so, they speak sharply. They act carelessly. They wound without fully seeing the wound they leave behind. This does not make their behavior right. It does not excuse what is harmful. But it helps us understand something essential. Not every blow carries truth. Not every insult contains wisdom. Not every rejection reveals your value. Sometimes it only reveals the limits of the other person's awareness. You can see this in ordinary life. In a family, a parent may speak harshly to a child, not because the child is unworthy, but because the parent never learned how to express fear except through control. A mother worries. A father feels pressure. Life hardens them, and instead of saying, "I am afraid for you," they say, "You are never enough." The child grows up carrying those words like a hidden sentence inside the chest. But those words were never a final truth. They were the language of someone who did not know how to love without fear. Among friends, it can happen more quietly. A friend becomes distant when your life begins to grow. Not because your joy is wrong, not because your presence has no value, but because your growth awakens something painful in them. Comparison, insecurity, a sense of being left behind. And instead of blessing your path, they become colder, shorter, less kind. Again, the pain is real, but the meaning is often misunderstood. Their distance does not always mean you have become less lovable. It may simply mean they are struggling with something they do not know how to name. In society, this becomes even more common. People judge quickly. They label easily. They mock what they do not understand. A stranger sees one moment of your life and believes they know your whole character. Someone on the internet speaks with certainty about your heart, your choices, your worth. But what are they truly seeing? Often very little. They are reacting from fragments, from assumptions, from moods, from their own private discomfort. And still, we take these things in. We let passing opinions settle into permanent wounds. We let another person's blindness become evidence against ourselves. This is why inner clarity matters, because if you do not know where another person ends and where you begin, you will spend your life carrying burdens that were never yours. The Stoic spirit reminds us that people act from the level of understanding they have reached. Some have discipline, some do not. Some have self-knowledge. Some are ruled by impulse. Some have learned how to pause before speaking. Some have not yet discovered that pause. So when harm comes, it is wise to ask, what is this really revealing? Is this about my worth? Or is this about their state of mind? Is this a judgment I must carry? Or is this an expression of their confusion? This question does not remove pain at once. Pain does not disappear just because the mind understands. The heart is slower than reason. And that is part of being human. You may know that someone's cruelty came from their own emptiness, and still feel hurt. You may understand that their words were shaped by anger, envy, or ignorance, and still lie awake remembering them. That does not mean you are weak. It means the soul does not heal at the same speed that truth is recognized. Still, this understanding matters because it stops us from turning every act of disrespect into a verdict on our identity. It creates one small space between what they did and what we believe about ourselves. And in that space, something gentle begins. A little dignity, a little distance, a little freedom. You start to see that another person's behavior is often a mirror of their inner condition, not a final measure of your value, not a sacred judgment, not the voice you must obey forever. And yet, even when we see this clearly, even when we know their actions came from their own wounds, something in us still aches, something still remembers, something still trembles in the quiet. So the question remains, if their behavior is a reflection of them and not a definition of us, then why do we still hurt? There is a reason pain lingers, not because the heart is weak, not because the mind is broken, but because when we are hurt, something deeper than the moment is touched. It is rarely only about the word that was said, or the silence that followed, or the face that turned away. Very often the pain reaches further in. It touches expectation. It touches attachment. It touches the quiet human longing to be seen without being diminished, to be loved without being tested, to be understood without having to bleed first. And when that longing is not met, the wound becomes heavier than the event itself. This is why two people can live through the same kind of hurt and carry it in very different ways. One feels sadness, then slowly returns to balance. The other carries it for years, repeats it in memory, reopens it in silence, builds a life around the echo of it. The difference is not always the event. Sometimes it is what the event touched inside them. There are expectations we rarely say aloud. We carry them quietly. We carry them into love, into friendship, into family, into work, into every place where the heart hopes to rest. We expect kindness from those who say they care. We expect fairness from those who stand close to us. We expect loyalty from those who have known our softness. We expect that if we give sincerely, we will not be treated carelessly. And these expectations do not make us foolish. They make us human. A person cannot live without hoping for some goodness, cannot open the heart without silently wishing it will be handled gently. So when harm comes, the pain is not only from what happened, it is also from the collapse of what we believed should have happened. That collapse is difficult, sometimes harder than the injury itself, because reality does not merely disappoint us. It shatters an inner picture, a picture of who someone was, a picture of what the relationship meant, a picture of how safe the world felt just yesterday. And once that picture breaks, the soul does not only grieve the act, it grieves the lost image, the lost expectation, the lost innocence that believed, surely this will not happen here. There is also attachment, not only attachment to people, but to roles, meanings, and emotional certainties. We become attached to being respected, to being chosen, to being remembered, to being answered with the same warmth we gave. We become attached to the idea that what matters to us must also matter to others in the same way, with the same tenderness, with the same depth. But life does not always move with equal feeling. Not everyone sees with the same heart. Not everyone values with the same care. And when this becomes visible, pain enters quietly, then spreads. Because attachment does not like difference. Attachment wants confirmation. It wants the outside world to say, Yes, what you feel is secure. Yes, what you love will remain. Yes, what you give will return to you untouched. But the world is rarely so obedient, and the heart suffers each time it asks life to promise what life was never built to guarantee. Then there is the longing for recognition. This pain is often hidden. People do not always admit it. But so much sorrow grows from this one hunger to be acknowledged, to be valued, to feel that our sincerity was not invisible, that our efforts were not dismissed, that our pain was not inconvenient, that our presence mattered. When someone wounds us, it can awaken an older ache. Not only this present moment, but all the moments before it when we felt unseen, unheard, unchosen, as if the world had looked through us and moved on. This is why certain hurts feel larger than they appear. A simple rejection can open the memory of 10 earlier rejections. A cold response can wake the loneliness of childhood. A betrayal in adulthood can stir the silent grief of all the times trust once failed before. The heart remembers in layers, not always clearly, not always logically, but deeply. And when those layers are touched, a person may cry for more than one reason, may tremble from more than one wound, may feel overwhelmed without fully understanding why the pain is this large. This is where a Stoic mind becomes gentle, not harsh, not cold, not dismissive. It does not say, "You should feel nothing." It does not demand that emotion disappear. It does not shame the heart for reacting like a heart, because emotion is not the enemy. Sorrow is not failure. Disappointment is not weakness. Even anger, in its first movement, is often only pain trying to protect itself. The Stoic spirit sees this. It understands that feelings arise, that they come before language sometimes, before control, before reason has fully entered the room. A wound is felt, a loss is felt, a humiliation is felt. This is part of being alive. But there is a difference between feeling something and handing your life over to it. There is a difference between the first wave and the decision to let that wave become your direction. This is where so many people suffer longer than they need to, not because they feel deeply, but because once emotion arrives, it becomes the interpreter of everything. Pain begins to tell the story. Anger begins to define the meaning. Fear begins to predict the future. And when emotion takes the place of clear seeing, the wound starts to grow beyond its original size. A person is hurt once by another, then hurt again by imagination, again by memory, again by internal repetition, again by the mind building a home inside the injury. This is not weakness either. It is simply what happens when the soul is left alone with pain, and no quiet space opens between feeling and belief. So the Stoic way is not to become stone, not to deny the trembling, not to silence grief before it has spoken. It is something more patient than that. It is the slow art of allowing feeling to exist without letting feeling become authority. To let sadness pass through without calling it truth. To let anger burn for a moment without building an identity from its fire. To let disappointment speak without signing your future over to its voice. This is not easy, especially at night, especially in the late hours when the world grows quiet and the mind becomes louder. That is when expectation returns. That is when attachment tightens. That is when the old hunger for recognition begins to ache again. And in those moments, a person can feel split in two. One part sees clearly. The other still hurts. One part understands. The other still longs. One part knows that not everything lost was ever truly ours to hold. And still, the hand remains open in the dark, as if waiting for something to return. Perhaps this is what makes inner struggle so human. Not that we do not know, but that knowledge and pain do not leave at the same time. The mind may arrive first. The heart may remain behind for a while, and so healing begins there, in that quiet distance between seeing and surrender, in that silent space where the feeling is still present, but no longer fully in command. And maybe that is where the real work must begin. There is a quieter strength that begins to appear when a person stops trying to manage every reaction around them, not because they no longer care, not because they have become distant, but because they slowly see how exhausting it is to place peace in the hands of other people. So much suffering grows there, in the hope that someone will finally speak differently, behave differently, understand more, regret more, return what they took. But the Stoic path turns the eyes inward, not in isolation, but in clarity. It asks a gentler question: what remains in my care even now? This question does not solve everything at once, but it changes the atmosphere inside the mind. A woman comes home after a long day. She has tried her best. She has carried responsibilities no one fully sees. At dinner, someone in the family speaks to her carelessly. Just a few words, nothing dramatic, but enough to leave a sting. In the past, that moment might have followed her through the whole evening. She might have replayed it while washing dishes, carried it into the bedroom, felt her chest tighten again each time she remembered the tone. Not because the words were so large, but because the mind kept returning to them, trying to undo them, trying to repair them from the inside. But one quiet Stoic principle begins here. Not everything that touches you deserves to remain inside you. The moment happened. The words were spoken. But whether they continue living in your mind with the same force is no longer only about the speaker. It becomes about your attention, about what you keep feeding, about whether you continue sitting beside the wound long after the door has closed. This does not mean pretending not to care. It means recognizing that inner space is precious, and not every injury should be given a permanent room there. Another person is criticized at work. Not unfairly, perhaps. Not perfectly either. Just enough to leave a feeling of being diminished. The body reacts first. Heat in the face, tension in the shoulders, a quick defense rising in the throat. This is natural. The Stoic way does not begin by demanding the feeling disappear. It begins by creating one small pause between feeling and response. A pause so brief that no one else may even notice it. But inside that pause, something important happens. The person remembers that the first movement of emotion is not yet a decision. They do not need to answer from the wound. They do not need to speak from the exact place where pride was touched. So they breathe once, maybe twice. And in that small delay, they recover something. Not control over the other person, not control over the situation, but control over the next thing they become. This is one of the deepest forms of inner steadiness. To understand that while the world may arrive suddenly, your response does not have to. In friendship, this becomes even more delicate. A message goes unanswered. A warm pattern begins to cool. The mind, being human, starts filling the silence. Maybe I said too much. Maybe I no longer matter. Maybe they have changed. And from here, suffering often grows, not from fact, but from interpretation. A Stoic principle enters quietly at this point. See what is there before adding what is not. This is harder than it sounds, because the mind dislikes emptiness. It would rather invent meaning than sit calmly with uncertainty. But so many wounds are deepened not by what happened, but by the story built around it. A delayed reply becomes rejection. A tired tone becomes disrespect. A distant week becomes permanent abandonment. And none of this is done out of foolishness. It is simply the mind trying to protect itself by finishing the story too soon. But clarity asks for patience, for the discipline of remaining close to what is real. The message has not been answered. That is what is real. Everything beyond that must be held more lightly. This is not emotional coldness. It is restraint, a refusal to let assumption take command of the heart. There is also the Stoic habit of returning to what can actually be shaped. A man is spoken about unfairly in a social circle. He hears that others have misunderstood him. Some have repeated things carelessly. Some have already formed opinions. At first, the mind rushes outward. He wants to correct every version, explain every detail, repair every image. This impulse is understandable. Most people want to be seen clearly, but eventually another truth becomes visible. Other people's thoughts are among the least stable things in life. They shift with mood, with rumor, with their own private preferences. Trying to command them fully is like trying to hold water in a closed fist. The tighter the grip, the more agitation appears. So the Stoic practice here is not passivity. It is selection. What part of this is mine? Perhaps it is mine to remain honest, to speak clearly when needed, to live in a way that over time becomes its own answer. But it is not mine to force understanding into every mind. It is not mine to chase approval until I disappear from myself. This is where dignity becomes lighter, because the heart no longer spends all its strength pushing against doors that were never meant to open by force. And then there is the quietest practice of all, the practice of returning to one's own character. After injury, many people ask, why were they like this? Why did they do that? Why could they not be gentler? These are natural questions, but they often lead into rooms with no real exit. The Stoic mind, after a while, turns toward a different question. In this moment, what kind of person am I becoming? This is not a grand question. It lives in small things, in whether bitterness is repeated at home after being received elsewhere, in whether disappointment becomes sharpness toward someone innocent, in whether pain hardens the face or quietly deepens understanding. A teacher is treated rudely by a stranger on the way home. Nothing dramatic happens, just enough to disturb the afternoon. Later, a child asks something simple. The teacher feels the old irritation ready to spill into this new moment. And here, the Stoic work becomes real, not in books, not in ideas, but in the choice not to pass an unhealed moment into another person's hands. The stranger cannot now be controlled. The earlier tone cannot be rewritten. But this next response still belongs to the teacher, and that belonging matters. It is one of the few places where peace can still be made. Little by little, this is how inner calm is built, not through perfect detachment, not through never being affected, but through repeated returns, back to the breath, back to the facts, back to what is still ours. Back to the part of life that can still be shaped with care. And over time, something soft begins to change. The world may remain imperfect. People may still misunderstand. Some moments will still sting. But the heart is no longer pulled so easily into every passing disturbance. It begins to stand in a different way. Less entangled, less hurried, less dependent on the weather of other minds. And in that quiet shift, there is relief. Not loud relief, not triumphant relief, just a small loosening inside, as if the soul, after holding too much for too long, has finally set something down. There comes a point in life when a person grows tired of winning, not because they have become weak, not because they no longer see injustice, but because they have lived long enough to notice something quiet and painful. Many victories do not bring peace. You can prove your point and still lose your rest. You can win the argument and still carry the noise of it for days. You can make someone feel your strength and still return home with a heavy mind. This is why the Stoic path does not revolve around defeating other people. It is not centered on the pleasure of being right. It is not built on the hunger to have the last word. It sees how expensive that kind of triumph can become. At first, the urge to win feels natural. Someone crosses a line. Someone speaks unfairly. Someone misunderstands you or reduces what you meant, or treats your sincerity as if it were something small, and immediately something inside rises. A need to respond, a need to correct, a need to show them that they have judged the wrong person. This movement is familiar to almost everyone, because to be misunderstood can feel like being erased. To be dismissed can feel like a theft of dignity. So the mind prepares itself, sentence after sentence, argument after argument. It gathers reasons. It sharpens memory. It looks for the perfect reply. And for a moment, this feels like power, but often it is only entanglement, because the mind, once tied to conflict, does not rest when the conversation ends. It continues in private. It replays. It edits. It imagines better comebacks. It returns to the scene again and again, as if inner peace could be recovered by improving a battle that is already over. This is the quiet cost of needing to win. The body may leave the room. The mind often does not. And that is why the Stoic spirit begins to see victory differently. To defeat another person is one thing. To remain inwardly undisturbed is something else entirely. These two are often mistaken for each other, but they are not the same. Winning over another person depends on their reaction, their admission, their silence, their defeat, their surrender. It asks the outside world to confirm that you prevailed, but inner peace does not wait for that. It does not require applause. It does not need the other person to finally understand. It does not depend on whether they regret what they did. This makes it a quieter form of strength, and a freer one, because the moment peace depends on another person's change of heart, peace becomes fragile. It becomes conditional. It becomes something delayed until the world behaves correctly, and the world rarely offers such clean timing. Sometimes people never see clearly. Sometimes they never apologize. Sometimes they continue as they are, certain in their own version, comfortable in their own blindness. If your calm must wait for their awakening, you may wait a very long time. This is why a more mature soul begins to loosen its grip on the need to conquer, not from passivity, not from fear, but from understanding. It understands that some battles keep you tied to the very thing you are trying to rise above. There are arguments that continue long after words have stopped. There are relationships where each exchange becomes a contest. Who hurt more? Who was more right? Who explained better? Who remained standing? But after enough years, a person starts to ask a different question. What is all this costing my spirit? What is the price of staying in this struggle? What part of me becomes smaller each time I return to prove myself? This question changes everything because it reveals something simple. Not every fight is worth the shape it leaves inside you. Not every correction is worth the disturbance it demands. Not every chance to win is worth becoming restless again. There is a difference between preserving your dignity and feeding your ego. Dignity is quiet. It does not beg to be recognized. It does not rush to display itself. It remains, even when others do not notice it. Ego is more anxious. It wants witnesses. It wants comparison. It wants a visible result. It wants to leave the scene with evidence of superiority. But the Stoic way moves away from that hunger, not because achievement is wrong, not because strength is unwelcome, but because the deepest strength does not need to humiliate anyone. It does not need to reduce another person in order to remain whole. There is a maturity in realizing that many people are fighting battles you do not need to join. They may invite you with their tone, with their provocation, with their insistence, with their small efforts to pull you into a contest of pride. And perhaps once you would have stepped forward. You would have answered everything. You would have defended every edge of yourself. But now, something in you is quieter, not empty, not defeated, simply clearer. You begin to see that walking away from certain struggles is not losing. It is choosing a different kind of preservation. You are not surrendering your worth. You are refusing to place your inner life in a room where nothing good can grow. There is freedom in that. A freedom many people do not notice until they finally taste it. The freedom of not needing to correct every false impression. The freedom of not chasing every misunderstanding. The freedom of allowing others to keep their limited view without turning it into your burden. The freedom of knowing that being unseen by some does not diminish what is true in you. This kind of freedom is subtle. It does not look dramatic. There is no loud scene, no public victory, no final declaration, only a quieter man, a calmer woman. Someone who has learned that the mind is too sacred a place to be turned into an arena for every passing conflict. And this is where real peace begins to separate itself from the image of triumph. Triumph wants an opponent. Peace does not. Triumph often needs a stage. Peace can live in silence. Triumph seeks recognition. Peace asks for nothing except space to breathe. One leaves the soul dependent. The other leaves it free. To live this way is not to become indifferent. It is to become less possessed by the drama of comparison, less trapped by the endless mathematics of pride, less interested in standing above others, more interested in standing firmly within yourself. Because in the end, what does it mean to win over someone if, after all the words are done, your own mind is still unsettled? What does it mean to be declared right if your nights remain restless? What does it mean to leave another person defeated if something in you has become harder, narrower, less at ease? There is a deeper success than that, a success that cannot always be seen. To leave a difficult moment without carrying its poison, to be insulted without becoming consumed, to be challenged without building your identity around response, to be judged without handing your peace over to judgment. This is not a small thing. This is one of the rarest forms of mastery, and perhaps the most beautiful, because it gives back to a person what conflict so often steals: their own inward space, their own silence, their own unbroken center. Then one day, without force, without announcement, without needing anyone to notice, you find yourself no longer standing in the old battlefield. The voices are still behind you. The dust is still in the air, but your feet are already on another road. A quiet road, open, pale with morning light. And somewhere ahead, where the noise can no longer follow, the path continues softly into the distance. There comes a quiet moment when the struggle begins to look different, not smaller, not unreal, but different. What once felt like a wound now feels like a place where something in you became more awake. What once felt unbearable now becomes part of the road you somehow walked through. Not perfectly, not without pain, but still, you walked through. And maybe that is enough to notice that the heart does not always heal by forgetting. Sometimes it heals by seeing more clearly, by no longer asking life to be softer than it is, by no longer asking people to give what they do not have, by no longer asking pain to explain itself too quickly. There is a certain peace in that, a quiet honesty, a way of standing inside reality without turning away. The Stoic spirit has always lived there, not in coldness, not in distance, not in becoming untouchable, but in learning how to remain steady in a world that does not stay still, to remain human without being ruled by every passing storm, to feel deeply without drowning in every feeling, to lose something without losing yourself, to be hurt without becoming bitterness, to be misunderstood without becoming noise. Perhaps this is why the deepest strength rarely looks dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not demand to be seen. It appears quietly, in the pause before a reaction, in the breath taken instead of the word thrown back, in the long night that does not break you even though it changes you, in the morning when you rise again with a softer face and a steadier mind. So much of life cannot be held, not people, not outcomes, not time, not the image you once had of how things were supposed to go. All of it moves, all of it changes, all of it leaves something behind, and the more tightly we try to hold, the more pain often enters through the hand. But there is another way to live, not by closing the hand in hardness, and not by reaching blindly for everything, but by learning when to hold gently, when to release, when to speak, when to remain still, when to step forward, when to let the moment pass without following it into darkness. This is not the life of someone who has escaped suffering. It is the life of someone who has stopped making suffering the center of all meaning. That change is quiet, almost invisible, yet it changes everything, because once the inner world is no longer pulled apart by every disappointment, every insult, every fear, every passing judgment, something begins to settle, not all at once, but gradually, like dust falling in an empty room, like water becoming still after a stone has sunk. And in that stillness, a person begins to return to what was there before the noise, a more silent self, a less frightened self, a self that does not need to win every moment or explain every wound or chase every missing answer, just a self that can remain, that can endure, that can look at life without asking it to become easier before peace is allowed to begin. Maybe that is the quiet gift hidden inside this way of seeing. Not that life suddenly becomes gentle, but that your relationship to it does. You stop resisting every shadow. You stop arguing with every season of loss. You stop believing that inner balance must wait for the world to become fair. And because of that, you begin to carry yourself differently. More slowly, more clearly, with less noise inside. Even sorrow changes there. It becomes less sharp, less desperate, still real, still heavy at times, but no longer endless, no longer a room without windows. Even loneliness changes there, even disappointment, even fear. They still visit, but they do not speak with the same authority. They arrive. They stay for a while. Then, little by little, they leave, and you remain, not unchanged, but more your own. Maybe this is all the Stoic heart ever tried to protect. Not comfort, not image, not control over the world. only this small inner flame that should not be handed over to every wind that passes. To keep that flame alive is already a kind of wisdom. To shelter it without hiding from life is already a kind of courage, and perhaps in the end, that is enough. Enough to walk through disappointment without becoming hollow, enough to meet uncertainty without kneeling before it, enough to lose what was never yours to keep and still remain faithful to the quiet center within. The world will go on changing, people will come and go. Some doors will open, some will close without warning. Some answers will never arrive, some wounds will grow silent but never fully disappear. This too is part of the path. And still, there is a way to walk it with dignity, with restraint, with calm, with a kind of inward softness that has nothing to prove. So when the noise returns, as it sometimes will, when memory stirs, when pain speaks again in the old familiar voice, perhaps what matters most is not that you silence it forever, only that you do not follow it all the way down, only that somewhere within there remains a place that is still, a place that watches, a place that does not run, a place that knows the storm is not the whole sky. And when the video ends, when the room grows quiet again, when nothing is left but your own thoughts and the sound of your breathing, maybe that is where this path truly begins. Not in certainty, not in perfection, just in silence, and in the simple decision to stay there a little longer. Some wounds close, some do not, but the soul learns to walk anyway.